The first class I ever taught at a university was about web development. And part of that course was focused on web design. And I think from the first time I taught that, I told my students that web design is not about how something looks, it's about how it works. So I think I've always taken this mindset that design is less about appearance and more about function. It's more about the problem that you're trying to solve. And so I always taught my students that design is not an art, it's a science. We should think of it at least as a science in the technology field. And I think it's in some ways kind of contradictory to what a lot of people think of as design. I think a lot of people grow up thinking design is more about like graphic design, or maybe it's about like interior design. And so they think about all these artistic elements and things like that. And sure, there's definitely a field and an area of design that focuses explicitly on these things. But in technology, at least the way I've taught it, has been focused on thinking about design as function and performance and less as the way something aesthetically looks. The way it looks is important, but in my opinion, it's far less important than the way it works. And so when I first started studying universal design and trying to understand more about this issue, I was doing my doctorate, and it was focused on a lot of social and political issues around universal design. So I always took a much broader perspective than I think a lot of people did when they thought about universal design. They always, at least my colleagues, would usually think about design more as about user interfaces. And again, about the functionality of those user interfaces, and that's fine. There's a real need for understanding how a user interface, or how the, let me see if I can describe what a user interface is, the way something appears in the interaction with a person and a piece of technology. Wow, that was a really complicated way of putting it. The interface that a person uses to use a piece of technology, I guess you could say. So their focus was more on those issues, those interactions, the interaction between the human and the computer, we could just say. And my focus had always been on broader kind of social issues. And so I started to think about design less about the functions and features of a user interface, for example, and more about the decision making that goes into creating those functions and features. And it wasn't until I started comparing the way I think about it to the way some of my colleagues thought about it that I really started to understand that the way I think about design is kind of different than what a lot of people, how a lot of people approach it. So as I started my career in universal design, and I was thinking about these broader social and political issues, the kinds of things that I cared about a lot was the sort of value systems that influence somebody's decision. So if I'm creating a website and I'm trying to decide, should I use this color or that color? What are the values that are behind that decision? What are the values that influence that decision? Maybe it's personal preference, right? Maybe it's like, I like blue instead of red, so I'm going to use blue. Or maybe it's kind of the way culture, kind of how they determine what a color means, right? So in certain cultures, colors mean one thing, and in other cultures, they might mean something different. Or the combinations of colors might mean something different culture to culture. And so my research really focused in on those value systems. So what sort of things influences somebody's decision? And color is a simple example, but somebody's decision when they're creating something, a piece of technology, for example. And then I also looked at a lot of issues around what are called norms. And norms are just basically judgments. So whether or not we think something's good or bad. So when we talk about personal preference, to say that, blue is a good color and red is a bad color, that's a normative judgment. And so a lot of the things I was looking at was what are not just the value systems, what matters to us, but do we think of those values, or do we think of something as good or bad? Is something kind of inherently, according to our judgment, our opinion, good or bad? And trying to understand a little bit more how that plays into those decisions that people are making whenever they create a new piece of technology. Now, this is super abstract, but it's really important because our values, the things we think are our judgments, our things we think are good or bad, they all influence every decision that we make. And then the third thing that I was really concerned about still am really concerned about when it comes to my research, and especially universal design, is the sort of processes that we put into place in our companies and our organizations and our universities and our government, the sort of practices. So what does it mean whenever we say we're going to update a website? Right? What are the processes that we have to go through? Who establishes those processes? Are they standardized? Who's making decisions along the way? So all of those three things kind of influence, the way I see it, the way things are designed. So it influences those decisions. If we can take and understand those three components, norms, values, and processes, then I think we'd have a really strong case for being able to change the kinds of decisions people make so that when we create technology, it's something that everyone can use equally. And that's the whole ambition and aim behind universal design. So I was always looking at design from a different lens, or a different set of lenses than a lot of my colleagues who were working in computer science. A lot of them looked at it because a lot of them were just looking at different features and functions of a user interface and maybe comparing them. And I mean, there's a real field of science behind this, and it's really, really important field of science. But my research was looking at things in a very different dimension. And I started looking at the way decisions are being made within organizations. I started looking at the way business models structure how people make decisions, looking at how organizational policies and practices structure people's decisions, or in some ways how people can subvert those organizational policies and procedures. So I really had my own take on universal design almost from the beginning, or at least a different take than a lot of my colleagues had. And I found that as I had presented my research around the world, and as people had listened and responded to my work, I found that there was a group of people that it resonated with. There was a group of people that I connected with that weren't necessarily computer scientists, although a lot of them were computer scientists, but they were policymakers, they were business owners, they were industry leaders. They were people who kind of, we believe they have a strong role and a responsibility when it comes to universal design. These people, I think the reason why it connected with them, because the way I thought about universal design was really anchored in issues around human rights. It was really anchored in issues around diversity and inclusion. And so I kind of took almost like a design thinking approach to universal design. So if you know what design thinking is, it's basically a way of bridging design and innovation. So it's really using design theory to approach problem solving, I guess you could say. That's a whole separate episode for a whole nother time. But I want to give you a little bit of background for how what I believe really helped me articulate my vision of what universal design is. So I think it was in 2017 or maybe even 2016, I met a colleague who worked at Harvard University, actually at the Harvard Law School. And I re-met them. You know, when academia, a lot of times you meet people, once a year for like 4 or 5 years straight because you're always going at the same conferences or you just work in the same kind of circles. So I met this person and I said, I would love to come to Harvard and just serve like a fellowship or just, be there and work under you for a little while. And he was crazy enough to say, yeah, let's do it. Let's make this happen. And so then it was on me to find the funding and make sure I can kind of do this. So it was 2018. I basically cobbled together a little bit of funding for the travel, a little bit of funding to support myself, but then a lot of it was my own self-funding. And there I was kind of heading off to Harvard University, which has like an amazing reputation, and especially the law school has an amazing reputation. So my mind was kind of blown, and it's just such a surreal experience, just doing something as basic as walking down the hall and using the restroom at the university, at the law school, because I'm imagining how many Nobel Prize winners, how many US presidents have come through those hallways. And it was humbling, I guess. And I mean, you can't imagine the imposter syndrome that I felt. I felt that I genuinely had not earned this kind of opportunity. And but it didn't mean that I wasn't going to take advantage of it. It was just that it took me, it still kind of feels like it never kind of happened, or it happened, but it was just an accident that it happened. But while I was there, I really got to meet some amazing people. And I'm not talking about famous people. I'm talking about people who are doing the kind of work that it takes to move human rights forward every day. And these are the kinds of people that fuel my yearning for this field, to fuel my desire to continue to pursue this field, because I see them working so hard and diligently, and I want to kind of match that energy and that effort. But my first day there, I remember going in to the office of my mentor and sitting with them, and they said, we don't have a specific office space for you because you're just kind of here. But what we can do is give you a conference room to work from if you want. And it was just a conference room down the hall. Pretty big room, had a big U-shaped wood table with wood chairs all around it, and had, kind of 3 large chalkboards at the front of the room, and your typical projector, very nice windows, so it had nice natural light coming in and everything like that. And I remember just sitting down and like taking out my computer, plugging it in, and trying to figure out what the heck I'm going to do while I'm here. I think I was there for almost a month and a half, 2 months. So what am I going to do over these 2 months that's going to give any meaning to me being here besides it just being something on my CV? Yay, I spent some time at Harvard. So what I did was I just started kind of mapping out everything that I had learned about this issue of universal design on the blackboard. And I literally used chalk. It was chalk and a chalkboard and a chalkboard eraser. So it wasn't anything kind of super fancy. And I just wrote down all the kind of key ideas, some of the terms that I had learned, the things that I think were essential to the work that I was studying, the research that I was doing, or that I had been doing for the past, I guess it was close to 10 years. But what I ended up with is kind of a distillation of what amounted to 4 key ideas or principles behind what I thought about when I thought about universal design, and 4 things that I don't think a lot of people had articulated before I had. So there was a lot of debate in the scientific journals about what universal design means and how that can be articulated, how that can be put into practice. But there hadn't been anything that's really approached it in a way that was really spelling it out. Everything that had spelled it out before was kind of old-fashioned and was hard to apply in today's reality. So I wanted to kind of create a new way of thinking about universal design. So I took some of the old stuff that was still good, kind of make sure I didn't throw out the baby with the bathwater, and merged it with some new ways of thinking, some things that I think were important for us to take us into the future around universal design, creating a more holistic view of things. And I don't want to give you the impression that this was some kind of stroke of genius. And honestly, I don't really believe in that sort of that mindset that like innovations or good ideas are just generated out of the blue, like bam, yay, I figured it out, eureka. I think that's kind of a false, it's an illusion, I think. It was just the next logical step in my work. I think anybody who had gotten to the point that I've gotten to in my career could have made that same step. I don't think there was anything unique about what I was doing. It was just taking universal design, which was fundamentally anchored in kind of accessibility and usability. When I talk about user interfaces, that's what I'm talking about, those functions. It's about accessing and using those functions. And then adding to it kind of an element of diversity, an element of inclusion, an element of equality, and an element of participation. And I remember when I spoke to my mentor afterwards, and I said, I think I have something interesting that we could publish, but I'm not sure, and it's a risk. Because with this sort of work, it can be a risk to publish something that isn't kind of been empirically researched for sometimes hundreds of years, but at least for half a lifetime. And I still am, and I was a younger researcher. And so I said, I need you to understand that if we put our names on this, then there's a risk that it might be criticized, or there's a risk that it might be just complete nonsense and nobody care about it. And he was very kind enough to not be too concerned about it. He said, if it's something that you think is right, if you believe that this is the case, then I think we can find a good anchoring for it, and we'll just develop it until it's robust enough to be published. So I went through all the what ifs, and eventually we settled on a opportunity to publish in the International Journal of Human Rights. And in the process, because this was my first time writing an article for a law journal, in the process, I had to learn a completely new way of writing. I had only been used to writing kind of in social science journals or in computer science journals, so I wasn't used to writing in law journals. And so he kind of taught me. I remember the first draft I sent them. I said, okay, here's, 8,000 words and how I can think about putting this together. And he immediately came back and said, okay, this is good. Now rewrite it. And so it was one of those moments where I had to be not a little bit, really humble, because I had already had at that time, 20 odd papers in my name. So I knew how to write academic articles. I knew how to write scientific articles. But since this was a new kind of field, I had to learn a new way of writing. Well, in the end, it got published. It's one of my proudest achievements, at least in science, that I've managed to do. It's a milestone. I think of it as a milestone in my career. There is a time before that paper came out, and there's a time that after that paper came out, and it really changed the trajectory of my work. And I hope it changes the way people think about this field of universal design. It certainly changed the way I thought about it. It really gave me a point of reference and a new way of approaching the choices that we make when we're creating something new or creating a new piece of technology. And in some ways, I hope that it does chart kind of a new course, a new direction for this field of universal design. But as I said, I don't really believe in these moments of inspiration. I don't believe, at least what we commonly associate with those eureka moments. I think a lot of people think of those moments as being like 0 to 100, like you had nothing and then suddenly you had this amazing idea and it changed the world. I don't think it's like that. I think for the most part, it's not 0 to 100, it's 99.9 to 100. So it's just that last step of something much greater that's kind of occurred over a much longer time frame. And it takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of luck. In my experience, it takes a lot of privilege. There's a lot of opportunities and open doors that have to be available to you. Breakthroughs are always a little bit risky because you always run the risk of it not being quite the way you expect it to be. But I think if you're in this kind of area, if you're facing this kind of a challenge, take the risk. What's the worst possible case scenario? Somebody proves you wrong, right? If that's the worst case scenario, that's a good deal, because that's what science is all about, being proven wrong. It's all about building off of what came before us so that we can go further. We can take that next step.